On a chilly October evening, Mrs. Patel, a seasoned civil rights attorney, sat behind the wheel of her Tesla, her heart still racing from the victory she'd just secured in the courtroom. Her dark curls were slightly disheveled from running her fingers through them during the intense final arguments, and her navy blue blazer was draped over the passenger seat. The digital clock on her dashboard read 8:45 p.m. She couldn't help but smile as she drove down the quiet suburban streets. The case had been challenging, representing a family who had faced excessive force during what should have been a routine traffic stop. For 6 months, she'd worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building an airtight case that exposed a pattern of discriminatory behavior. As she waited at a red light, her phone buzzed with a message from her daughter. "Did you win, Mom?" Mrs. Patel felt a wave of emotion wash over her. This wasn't just about winning a case. It was about making the world a little safer for her own child. The streetlights cast long shadows across her car as she cruised through the well-maintained neighborhoods. Cookie-cutter houses with perfectly trimmed lawns lined both sides of the street, their windows glowing warmly in the growing darkness. She thought about calling her mother, who had always supported her dream of becoming a lawyer, even when others said it wasn't a suitable career choice. Her mind wandered to the moment in court when the jury forewoman had read the verdict. The look of relief on her clients' faces, the tears in their eyes, those were the moments that reminded her why she'd chosen this path. Her own journey hadn't been easy. She remembered the countless nights studying for the bar exam, the rejection letters from law firms, and the subtle discrimination she still faced, even after building a reputation as one of the city's top civil rights attorneys. The Tesla's quiet hum was interrupted by a familiar song on the radio, the same one that had been playing when she got her first job offer. She turned up the volume slightly, letting the music mix with her thoughts. The victory today wasn't just for her clients. It was a message to the entire police department that change was necessary and possible. Through her rearview mirror, she noticed the rows of trees along the boulevard were starting to show their fall colors. It had been exactly 10 years since she'd opened her own law firm, starting with nothing but a small office and an unwavering commitment to justice. Now, her firm handled some of the most significant civil rights cases in the state. As she turned onto Oak Avenue, she spotted the local coffee shop where she'd spent countless hours preparing for this case. The owner, an elderly man who always saved her favorite corner table, waved as she drove past. These small gestures of community support had helped her through the toughest days of her career. Her Tesla's navigation system indicated she was just 15 minutes from home. She thought about the dinner waiting in the slow cooker, her grandmother's recipe for comfort food that she'd started this morning, knowing she'd need something soothing after an intense day in court. The familiar scent would probably be filling the house by now. The street lights flickered on one by one as dusk settled in. Mrs. Patel adjusted her rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of her tired but satisfied expression. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. Success isn't just about winning. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. She was so lost in thought that she almost missed the police cruiser that had pulled out behind her. At first, she didn't think much of it. This was a safe neighborhood, after all. But as the cruiser continued to follow her for several blocks, a familiar unease began to creep in. She checked her speedometer, exactly at the limit. Her tail lights were working. She'd just had them checked last week. Still, years of experience representing clients in similar situations had taught her to trust her instincts. She made sure her dashboard camera was recording, just as she advised all her clients to do. Her heart rate quickened slightly, but her face remained calm. She'd been here before, both as a lawyer and as a woman of color. The only difference was that this time, she was uniquely prepared for whatever might come next. The red and blue lights hadn't flashed yet, but Mrs. Peddle knew it was only a matter of time. She took a deep breath, mentally preparing herself for what was about to unfold. The police cruiser's lights suddenly flashed to life, painting the quiet street in alternating red and blue. Mrs. Patel carefully signaled and pulled over to the curb, positioning her car under a street lamp. Her hands moved with practiced precision as she turned on the interior lights and placed them at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. Through her side mirror, she watched the officer emerge from his patrol car. His hand was already resting on his holster, a detail she had seen countless times in the cases she handled. She could hear his heavy footsteps approaching, amplified by the quiet of the evening. Her dashboard camera blinked steadily, recording everything. "License and registration," the officer demanded, shining his flashlight directly into her face before she could even roll down her window completely. "Officer Thompson." She caught his name on his badge, spoke with an edge in his voice that she recognized all too well. His stance was aggressive, leaning into her space more than necessary. "Good evening, Officer Thompson." Mrs. Patel responded calmly, her voice steady despite the familiar knot forming in her stomach. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" She kept her hands visible, movements slow and deliberate, the same advice she'd given to countless clients. The officer's response came quick and harsh. "You were swerving back there." His flashlight beam swept across the car's interior, lingering on her expensive briefcase and the stack of legal documents on the passenger seat. "Had a few drinks tonight?" Mrs. Patel felt her jaw tighten, but her voice remained professional. "No, sir. I'm coming from the courthouse. I haven't been swerving, and my dashboard camera has been recording my entire drive home." She emphasized the last part slightly, watching his expression change. "The courthouse." Officer Thompson's tone shifted slightly, but he pressed on. "What business did you have there?" The question came with an unmistakable note of skepticism that made her blood simmer. "I'm an attorney," she replied, reaching slowly for her purse. "I'll get my Bar Association ID along with my license. I'm going to reach into my bag now." She narrated her movements, just as she'd advised her clients to do countless times. The officer's flashlight followed her every move as she carefully retrieved her credentials. Her fingers brushed past the business cards from the day's victory, a reminder of why moments like these mattered so much. As she handed over her IDs, she noticed his eyes widen slightly at her Bar Association card. His posture changed almost imperceptibly as he read her name and credentials. She knew that moment well. The sudden realization that the person they'd pulled over wasn't who they'd expected. "Mrs. Patel," he said, his voice now markedly different. "You're the attorney from the Henderson case." The edge in his voice had disappeared, replaced by something that sounded almost like nervousness. "Yes, that would be me," she replied evenly. "Officer Thompson, we both know there was no swerving. Would you like to tell me the real reason you pulled me over?" Her voice was calm but firm, the same tone she used in the courtroom. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken understanding. Through her window, she could see him shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his earlier confidence crumbling. The red and blue lights continued to flash, illuminating the growing discomfort on his face. She watched him glance back at his patrol car, then at her dashboard camera, its red recording light steady and unwavering. In that moment, she saw the realization dawn on him. He had just racially profiled one of the state's most prominent civil rights attorneys, and every second was being recorded. The tables had turned, but Mrs. Patel felt no satisfaction, only a familiar weariness. This wasn't just about one traffic stop or one officer. It was about a system that needed changing, a conversation that needed to happen. As she sat there, waiting for Officer Thompson's next move, she thought about all her clients who had faced similar situations but didn't have the protection of a law degree or a prominent reputation. The night air grew colder, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Officer Thompson cleared his throat, clearly struggling with what to say next. Mrs. Patel knew this moment could go one of two ways. It could end in defensive anger, or it could become something more meaningful. "Officer Thompson," Mrs. Patel broke the tense silence. "I think we should have a conversation." Her voice remained professional, but carried a warmth that seemed to catch the officer off guard. She reached over and turned down the heat in her car, preparing for what she knew would be an important moment. The officer stood awkwardly by her window, her license still in his hand, the flashlight now pointed at the ground. The red and blue lights continued to paint shadows across both their faces. A car drove past slowly, its driver craning their neck to see what was happening. "Ma'am, I apologize if there was any misunderstanding," he began, but Mrs. Patel gently raised her hand. "There's no misunderstanding here," she said. "We both know exactly what happened. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" She could see the defensive response forming on his lips, but something made him pause. Maybe it was her calm demeanor, or perhaps the events of her recent court victory were still fresh in his mind. Either way, his shoulders dropped slightly, and for the first time since approaching her car, he truly looked at her. "Would you like to see something?" Mrs. Patel asked, reaching for her briefcase. She pulled out a manila folder filled with statistics and photographs. "These are from cases I've handled just this year. 23 traffic stops, Officer Thompson. 23 stories just like this one, except those drivers didn't have a law degree to protect them." She handed him a photograph of a young father standing next to his damaged car. This gentleman was pulled over for a broken tail light that wasn't actually broken. He lost his job because the stop made him late for work. She pulled out another photo. This woman was dragged out of her car in front of her children because an officer thought she was acting suspicious. Officer Thompson shifted his weight uncomfortably, but he didn't look away from the photos. The night had grown quieter, as if the world was holding its breath for this moment. A gentle breeze rustled through nearby trees, carrying the scent of autumn leaves. "I'm not showing you these to shame you," Mrs. Patel continued, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm showing you because you have the power to be part of the change. Every interaction, every traffic stop, every decision you make can either reinforce the problem or help solve it." She watched as he looked down at his badge, then back at the photos in his hands. His face showed a mix of emotions: defensiveness, shame, and something that looked like understanding. The flashlight in his hand trembled slightly. "You know what the hardest part of my job is?" she asked, not waiting for his response. "It's not winning cases. It's not gathering evidence. It's looking into the eyes of people who've lost faith in the system that's supposed to protect them. People who teach their children to be afraid of the very officers who should be keeping them safe." A nearby porch light flickered on, casting long shadows across the street. In the distance, a siren wailed, reminding them both of the world beyond this moment. Mrs. Patel watched as Officer Thompson's expression shifted from discomfort to something deeper: recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. "I have a daughter," she said softly, touching a photo on her dashboard. "Every time I leave the house, she asks me if I'll be safe. Not because of criminals, Officer Thompson, but because of interactions like this one. That's not the world I want her to grow up in. I don't think it's the world you want to create either." The weight of her words hung in the air between them. Officer Thompson looked at her credentials again, then at the dashboard camera, still faithfully recording their interaction. His next words came out slowly, thoughtfully, as if he was choosing them with great care. "You're right," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't—" He paused, struggling to find the right words. "This isn't who I wanted to be when I put on this badge." The admission seemed to surprise them both. Mrs. Patel saw something change in his eyes. A wall coming down, a door opening. She knew from experience that this moment could be the beginning of real change, but only if handled with care. The next few minutes would be crucial. Mrs. Patel recognized the sincerity in Officer Thompson's voice, and she made a decision. "Would you mind if we talked for a few minutes? Maybe somewhere a bit more comfortable than standing by my car." She gestured to a well-lit coffee shop just ahead, its warm lights still glowing despite the late hour. Officer Thompson hesitated, then nodded. He called in his location and status to dispatch, while Mrs. Patel carefully pulled her car into the coffee shop's parking lot. The neon OPN sign buzzed quietly as they both stepped out of their vehicles. Inside, the coffee shop was nearly empty. The owner, Mr. Chen, looked up from wiping down the counter and smiled warmly at Mrs. Patel. She was a regular here during her long working days. His eyebrows raised slightly at the sight of the uniformed officer following her, but he simply nodded and started preparing her usual order. They chose a corner booth, away from the windows. The smell of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air, creating a strangely normal atmosphere for what was about to be a very important conversation. Officer Thompson removed his hat, revealing graying temples and worry lines that made him look older than he probably was. 2 coffees and some of those almond cookies you love so much, Mr. Chen said, placing the items on their table. He gave Mrs. Patel a gentle pat on the shoulder before walking away. The gesture wasn't lost on Officer Thompson, who watched the interaction with curious eyes. "You know," Mrs. Patel began, wrapping her hands around the warm coffee mug, "I've been coming here for 10 years. When I first started my practice, Mr. Chen would let me work here for hours, even when I could only afford 1 coffee." She smiled at the memory. "He judged me by who I was, not what I looked like or where I came from." Officer Thompson stared into his coffee cup, his fingers nervously tapping against the ceramic. "I didn't become a cop to make people feel afraid," he said quietly. "I wanted to help people. Somewhere along the way, I started seeing threats instead of people." The ceiling fan spun lazily above them, creating a gentle background hum. Through the window, they could see their vehicles parked side by side, her Tesla and his patrol car, such different symbols of authority and success. "Tell me about your best day on the job," Mrs. Patel said suddenly. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He looked up, confused. "Not your biggest arrest or most exciting chase. Tell me about a day when you really helped someone." His face softened as he thought back. Last winter, there was this elderly couple. Their heat had gone out during a cold snap. Instead of just calling it in, I stayed with them. Found some space heaters in my trunk, made sure they were warm until the repair company came. A small smile appeared on his face. "They still send me Christmas cards." Mrs. Patel nodded encouragingly. "That's the officer you wanted to be, isn't it? The one who sees people who need help, not potential threats." She pulled out more photos from her briefcase, this time showing community police events, officers playing basketball with kids, helping at local food banks. "These are from departments that have embraced change," she explained. "They've seen complaints drop, community trust improve, and their officers report feeling more satisfied with their work. It's not about being soft on crime, it's about being smart about community." Officer Thompson picked up one of the photos, studying it carefully. In it, an officer was teaching a group of kids how to fix a bicycle. The joy on everyone's faces was genuine, unforced. "I used to do things like this," he said softly. "When did I stop?" The question hung in the air as Mr. Chen brought them fresh coffee. The clock on the wall showed it was getting late, but neither seemed to notice. This moment felt too important to rush. "It's not too late to start again," Mrs. Patel said gently. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but it has to start somewhere. Why not here? Why not tonight?" Outside, the traffic had thinned to almost nothing. The street lights cast long shadows through the coffee shop windows, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed the hour. Officer Thompson straightened in his seat, something new flickering in his eyes. Determination, perhaps, or hope. Mr. Chen refilled their coffee cups one last time as Officer Thompson began sharing more about his 15 years on the force. His voice grew animated as he talked about his early days, the community programs he'd started, the relationships he'd built, the trust he'd earned. Then his tone changed as he described how things slowly shifted. "Budget cuts came first," he explained, stirring his coffee absently. "Community programs were the first to go. Then we got new leadership, new policies. Everything became about numbers. How many stops? How many tickets? How many arrests? He shook his head slowly. We stopped asking, how can we help? And started asking, who can we catch? Mrs. Patel listened intently, noting how his shoulders had relaxed, how his earlier defensiveness had melted away. The wall clock ticked softly in the background, marking each moment of this unexpected meeting. Can I show you something else? She opened her phone and pulled up a video. This is from a body cam, recorded last week. The footage showed a traffic stop gone wrong. Raised voices, escalating tensions, fear on both sides. Now watch this one. She switched to another video where an officer approached a car differently, respectful, professional, explaining each step. Same situation, different outcomes, she explained. The first officer was focused on control. The second was focused on communication. She paused the video. Which officer would you want your children to meet? Officer Thompson's face reflected the glow from the phone screen as he watched. His coffee sat forgotten, growing cold. Outside, a light drizzle had started, creating gentle patterns on the coffee shop windows. I have a son, he said suddenly, pulling out his own phone. He's 12. Smart kid, wants to be a police officer like his dad. He showed Mrs. Patel a photo of a bright-eyed boy in a junior police academy uniform. Last week, he asked me why his best friend's parents tell him to be careful around police. I didn't know what to say. Mrs. Patel nodded understanding. The rain outside grew stronger, drumming steadily on the roof. Mr. Chen had started closing up, though he made no move to rush them out. The gentle clinking of dishes and soft jazz music created a peaceful backdrop to their conversation. You know what the real irony is? Officer Thompson continued, his voice thick with emotion. When I was in the academy, my instructor always said our most powerful weapon wasn't our gun. It was our ability to talk to people, to understand them. He laughed softly. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that. Mrs. Patel reached into her briefcase one final time. I have something for you, she said, pulling out a business card and a brochure. Next month, I'm running a workshop at the police academy. It's about bridging the gap between law enforcement and the community. We bring in officers, community members, experts, people who want to make real change. Officer Thompson took the materials, studying them carefully. The brochure showed photos of police officers and civilians working together, sharing meals, having conversations just like the one they were having now. It's not about pointing fingers or assigning blame, Mrs. Patel explained, watching his reaction. It's about understanding each other's perspectives and finding better ways forward. We already have 15 officers signed up. The rain had settled into a gentle patter, and the coffee shop lights seemed to glow warmer in response. Officer Thompson looked at the brochure, then at Mrs. Patel, then back at the photo of his son on his phone. You know, he said slowly, maybe everything happens for a reason. Maybe I was supposed to make that traffic stop tonight. He straightened his uniform and sat up taller. Count me in for the workshop. And I think I know a few other officers who might be interested too. Mrs. Patel smiled, recognizing the look of someone who had found their way back to their original purpose. The night had turned out far differently than either of them had expected, but sometimes the most important changes start in the most unexpected ways. As they prepared to leave, Mr. Chen appeared with 2 paper bags. Cookies for the road, he said simply, handing one to each of them. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the wet pavement reflected the street lights like mirrors. Something had shifted tonight, something important. The next few weeks brought changes that nobody at the police department could have predicted. Officer Thompson didn't just attend Mrs. Patel's workshop. He became one of its most vocal supporters. The story of their late-night coffee shop conversation had spread, not as gossip, but as an example of what could happen when people took the time to really listen to each other. On a crisp morning 3 weeks after their encounter, Officer Thompson stood before his squad during the morning briefing. His hands were steady as he shared his experience, though his voice carried the weight of someone sharing something deeply personal. "I almost made the biggest mistake of my career that night," he told his fellow officers. "But instead, I learned the most important lesson." He passed around copies of the dashcam footage from his encounter with Mrs. Patel, using it as a teaching tool rather than hiding it in shame. The room was quiet as they watched, some officers shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others nodding in recognition. When the video ended, something remarkable happened. Officers began sharing their own stories. A veteran officer spoke about his struggles with implicit bias. A rookie admitted her fear of making mistakes in an increasingly complex world. Mrs. Patel's workshop wasn't just a one-time event anymore. It had evolved into a weekly discussion group where officers could speak openly about their challenges and fears. They talked about the pressure to make quotas, the split-second decisions that kept them up at night, and their genuine desire to serve their communities better. One rainy afternoon, Officer Thompson organized a community basketball game. He invited kids from the local middle school to play against the officers. The gym echoed with laughter and shouts of encouragement. His son was there too, proudly watching his father bridge the gap between his uniform and the community he served. "Remember when you asked me why your friend's parents were scared of police?" he asked his son during a break in the game. "I'm working on changing that. We all are." His son's smile was worth more than any commendation he'd ever received. The changes weren't always easy. Some officers resisted, clinging to old habits and attitudes. But Officer Thompson had learned patience from Mrs. Patel. He shared success stories, invited skeptics to community events, and slowly, mindsets began to shift. One officer started a program where they would park their patrol cars and walk their beats, actually talking to shop owners and residents. Another organized a monthly coffee meetup where community members could share their concerns in a casual setting. Mrs. Patel noticed the changes too. Her clients reported different experiences during traffic stops. More respect, better communication, less fear. She kept the coffee shop receipt from that night pinned to her office wall, a reminder that change was possible, one conversation at a time. The local newspaper ran a story about the department's transformation. They interviewed Mr. Chen, who had turned his coffee shop into an unofficial meeting spot for officers and community members. "Good coffee brings good conversation," he said simply, continuing his tradition of keeping the shop open late when needed. 6 weeks after their traffic stop, Officer Thompson sat in his patrol car, watching a group of kids playing street hockey. Instead of seeing potential troublemakers, he saw what they really were, just kids having fun. A minor traffic violation caught his eye, but instead of immediately hitting the lights, he thought about whether this was an opportunity for enforcement or education. He remembered Mrs. Patel's words about every interaction being a chance to either reinforce problems or create solutions. His hand moved away from the light bar. Instead, he parked his car and walked over to the driver, introducing himself with a smile. That evening, he sent a text to Mrs. Patel. "Made 3 stops today. Had 3 conversations. 3 people drove away feeling safer than when they were pulled over. Thank you." As she read the message in her office, Mrs. Patel smiled. On her desk lay invitations from 3 other police departments, all requesting similar workshops. The ripples from that one traffic stop were spreading, changing not just one officer or one department, but potentially transforming police-community relationships across the entire region. 3 months after that fateful traffic stop, the police department's training room was packed with officers from across the state. Officer Thompson stood at the podium, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights as he shared the department's remarkable journey of change. "It started with a traffic stop," he began, his voice carrying to the back of the room. But it became something much bigger. Behind him, a screen displayed statistics that told a powerful story. Complaints down by 60%, community engagement up by 80%, and officer job satisfaction improved by 70%. Mrs. Patel sat in the audience, watching the officer who had once pulled her over now teaching others about bias awareness and community policing. She thought about how far they'd come from that rainy night outside the coffee shop. The changes had gone far beyond numbers on a chart. The department had created a new position, Community Bridge Officer, and Officer Thompson was the first to hold this title. His patrol car now carried children's books, emergency food supplies, and basic household repair tools alongside the standard police equipment. Last week, Officer Thompson told the room, "I helped an elderly woman fix her broken porch light instead of just noting it as a code violation." The next day, she brought cookies to the station and introduced us to all her grandchildren. He smiled at the memory. That's what real police work should look like. The success stories kept coming. A young officer shared how she'd helped organize a neighborhood cleanup instead of just ticketing people for littering. Another described starting a homework help program at the community center, where officers tutored kids after school. During the lunch break, Mrs. Patel walked through the station's hallways, now decorated with photos of officers at community events. She stopped at one that showed Officer Thompson teaching bicycle safety to a group of kids. His face lit up with genuine joy. "That's my favorite too," said a voice behind her. It was the police chief, who had been skeptical of the changes at first, but now championed them. Thompson reminded us what we're really here for, to serve and protect, not just enforce. The afternoon session focused on practical changes. Officers learned new approaches to traffic stops, with role-playing exercises that emphasized communication over confrontation. They practiced explaining their actions, asking permission before reaching for documents, and finding opportunities to turn enforcement into education. Mr. Chen had catered the event, his coffee and cookies fueling discussions that stretched long past the scheduled end time. His shop had become a symbol of the department's transformation, a place where officers regularly sat down with community members to share concerns and find solutions. In one corner of the room, Officer Thompson's son proudly helped distribute training materials. He wore a Junior Police Academy t-shirt, but more importantly, he wore a smile that showed he was no longer confused about why some people feared the police. He was part of the change making that fear unnecessary. As the day wound down, Mrs. Patel took the podium for the closing remarks. She looked out at the sea of uniforms, not just from their city, but from departments across the state. Each face represented the potential for change, for turning routine encounters into opportunities for understanding. 3 months ago, I was pulled over on my way home, she began. Today, I'm watching that same traffic stop transform policing in our community. But the real change isn't in policies or procedures. It's in the hearts and minds of officers who remembered why they first put on the badge. After the session, Officer Thompson found her in the hallway. He looked different now, more confident, more at peace with his role. "My son asked me something interesting this morning," he said. "He asked if he could invite his friend's parents to ride along in my patrol car. The same parents who used to tell him to be careful around police." Mrs. Patel smiled, understanding the significance. One traffic stop had led to one conversation, which led to one officer changing his approach. That officer influenced his department, and now that department was influencing others. The ripples were becoming waves.